following presentation was recorded live by Voices from Jerusalem.
We're going to be doing, again, this is very interesting stuff. I highly recommend. I'm giving you the overview. If you take an art scroll, Tanakh, and read through it, I think you'll find it very interesting. The stories are quite interesting. We don't have the time to go into them in detail. But we're in what is the remaining period of time of the First Temple period. We're going to talk about the destruction of both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom. We haven't even explained that we have such things yet. Close the window. Thanks. I left off one little detail. I remember after class yesterday, I realized that one detail was left out. We're talking about the problems of leadership in the Jewish people. And now we're talking about the divided monarchy, this class. But I want to mention a little detail I forgot, which is very important in the story of King Saul going to war with the Amalekites. I mentioned that he keeps the animals alive, but he makes a much bigger mistake. He also keeps King Agag alive. Remember what we were talking about last class? He not only spares the animals, he spares the king. And not only does he spare the king, but the king, being a royal prisoner, gets to have a woman, right, with him that night, who he's going to end up impregnating. And the end of the story is that when Samuel shows up, what really upsets Samuel is to let the king live. Forget the animals. Because we talked about that the Amalekites have it in their soul, this hatred of God and the Jewish people. So if his seed carries on, it's going to mean trouble for the Jewish people down the road. And we're going to see that Saul has misplaced mercy and is weak in that respect and doesn't listen to God. And because of that, the Jewish people are going to suffer, at which point the Talmud jumps in and says, Al tiyeh tzaddik harbe. Don't be so righteous. You know, that's my don't be more Catholic than the Pope idea again. He thinks he's being merciful. He spares the king. We're going to have a lot of problems in the future. And by the way, Samuel goes, after telling Saul he's finished, he goes to Agag, the king who's in prison, and he says to Agag, just as your sword has made women childless, I too make your mother childless. And it says, and Samuel hacked Agag to bits, which is an unusual thing for a prophet like Samuel to do. And then he goes back to his house. Okay, but there we're going to see in the future, when we get to the Purim story, we're going to see the consequences of misplaced mercy. There's a time to be merciful and a time to be just. And sometimes if you mix the two and you think you're being more righteous than you should be, big problems. And this is just one of the examples of weakness on the part of leaders, as great as Saul is, it's going to cause us a lot of problems later. Your question?
Now, Saul was supposed to be this great figure, and Hashem chose him to be the king. Why would he choose him if he knew he would be weak and sad?
Excellent question. This, by the way, is a very basic point of Jewish philosophy, which I'm going to give you a great example in this class today. God knows what you're going to choose, but He doesn't judge you in advance. That's a very interesting question. You have free will. He knows what's going to happen, but it's not that you don't have free will. You really are choosing. It's just that God knows what you're going to choose, and you're not judged on what you will choose in the future. It's a very interesting and a very difficult concept for us to understand. So when I'll give you another example, when we get a little bit later in the story, we'll talk about the story of Isaiah the prophet and Hezekiah the king. We'll see a great example of exactly the point. So let's hold on to that.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So does he also blame leaving the king alive on the people?
He doesn't blame it on the people. It's the problem of the king not saying this is the law and this is what God tells me to do. There's times when the king's not supposed to listen to the people. When you get a command from God, you don't decide you know better, or because the people say otherwise, you go against the will of God. Okay, now let's talk about, the book of Kings starts out, we have first book of Kings, second book of Kings. Now, by the way, the first and second stuff, all of these first and second books are done by Christian editors of the Bible when it was printed in medieval Europe. When it was originally given, we didn't have first and second books. We kept the verses and chapters and stuff that the Christian editors and printers of the Bible put in, because it's easy to organize the material, but just a point of trivia for you. But the first book of Kings, which begins with Solomon, it sort of begins at the zenith, the high point of Jewish history, and ends in a very bad way. By the second book of Kings, the end, it starts off bad and it gets much, much worse. It ends in absolute disaster. And that's what we're going to look at today. The relatively rapid fall from what is a very high level. Now Solomon, we talked about Solomon last class. Solomon being a tremendous leader, following in David's footsteps, building the temple. We have the Jewish people in an ideal state. We have a king of a great stature. We have a temple, high priest. We have the court. We have the whole world coming to learn from the Jews. We have 40 years of peace and prosperity. And again, I said, if the next king had been a guy like we'll see in this class, a guy like Hezekiah, who's the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of King David, probably all of Jewish history and all of human history would have been different. But unfortunately, Solomon chooses as a successor one of his sons whose name is Rehoboam. Now, what does Rehoboam do? Rehoboam goes up north to have himself crowned king. Because in Israel, even though it's a united country, there's always a bit of tension between the northern and southern part of the country. Sort of like in America before the Civil War. You have the 10 tribes in the north. Jerusalem is middle ground. They sort of felt they're in a different place geographically, a different state of mind somewhat. So Rehoboam, to show that he's king of all the Jewish people, goes up north. I believe he goes to Beit El to have himself crowned king. And the Jewish people of the northern tribes send a delegation. And they say to Rehoboam, look, Solomon, as great as he was a tough king. To build the temple, it was a big national building project. Not to compare the two, but like Louis XIV builds Versailles. He bankrupts France in the 16th century. It's such a tremendous building project. The taxes. Solomon, to build this, he had corvées. He had to have sort of conscripted labor from the Jewish people who would come, and it wasn't voluntary. He had to come and help build the temple, and he had to tax people, and they had all this building, and it was tough. He was a tough guy. So the Jewish people, the 10 northern tribes, say, maybe you'll mellow out a little and go easy on us. So what does Rehoboam do? He asks Solomon's old advisors. And there's something to be said for wisdom. In Jewish law, you stand up for an old person, even an old non-Jew, because wisdom, by age gives you wisdom automatically. If you live long enough through life, you learn things about life. So he goes to the wise old advisors of his father Solomon, who tell him, listen to the Jewish people. Chill out, go easy on them. And then what does he do? He ignores them and goes to his young upstart, teenage advisors. Always bad news. And what do they say? They say, you better show the Jewish people who's boss. And he tells the Jewish people, you think my father was tough? I'm much worse. Big mistake. Remember we said the Jewish people, what's our big strength? We're tough, we're stubborn. We don't bend, we're not flexible. So what do the Jewish people do? They say, you think you're going to be tough? Bye. We're leaving. 10 of the tribes secede. They go off and make their own country. And they call it Israel. We're going to have a split, like America, 1860, right? A split of what was a great nation into two smaller nations. And this is a tremendous disaster for many, many reasons. First of all, one thing God has no patience for is the Jewish people killing each other. Okay, that's bad news number one. Bad news number two is we're supposed to be doing this as a people. We're one unit. We can't do it divided. It also means on the geopolitical level, the strong, unified nation of Israel is now a weak, divided nation, which is going to fall prey to the re-emerging empires of Egypt and Babylon. It's bad news. Now, the prophet Shemaiah goes and basically, and it's interesting, we have prophets who are going to, for this whole period of time, for it's hundreds and hundreds of years, something like 600 years, we're going to go through from to the end of the Judges, to the end of the First Temple period, and afterwards. We're going to have all of these different prophets who are going to be going back and forth through the northern and southern kingdoms. And their major job, and all the prophets we remember, by the way, at this period of time, their major goal is going to be to get the Jewish people to get their act together. Okay, to avoid destruction. Remember, the basic promise is, do what you're supposed to do and no one will bother you. Don't, and you won't be allowed to live in the land. So the prophet Shemaiah goes and basically declares this is the will of God. The 10 northern tribes, which make this country called Israel, appoint as their king a man by the name of Yerovam ben Nevat. They do this just to confuse you. Rehoboam, Yerovam. Yerovam was a great man. He was a big Talmud Chacham, big scholar. He stood up to King Solomon at one point. He was a man of tremendous leadership ability. And the prophet Shemaiah tells him, look, this is the will of God. Because Rehoboam, Solomon's son, does not seem to be mature enough to rule the whole Jewish people yet. So you know what? You split away for a few years until Rehoboam gets his act together, and then you're going to merge back together again. That's the will of God. Okay? Now, unfortunately, the famous statement about power, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you get a guy like Yerovam is a classic case of power corrupting him. Once he gets into power, he doesn't want to lose his power. Okay, and it's going to cause tremendous problems. Now, the southern kingdom is going to keep Rehoboam as their king, and Jerusalem as their capital. And we have a split right to the north of here. 2 separate countries, which, by the way, they're going to go to war, they're going to fight. I mean, initially Shemaiah tells Rehoboam, don't go and forcibly rejoin the 2 kingdoms. It's not the will of God now. But we're going to have a lot of problems in the future. The northern kingdom, what does Yerovam ben Nevat do? He realizes he likes being in power, but he also realizes as soon as we get to the next big holiday, like Passover or Shavuos or Sukkot, all the Jewish people are going to want to go back to Jerusalem to go to the temple, which he's supposed to do. And what are they going to see there? They're going to see the temple and the holy city of Jerusalem. And they're going to see the grandson of King David and the high priest. And they're going to tell Yerovam, like, bye, we don't want you as a king anymore. We want to re-merge with the Jewish people, which is what they're supposed to want to do. So what does he do? He totally goes off course. He says, I'm going to set up alternative religious sites for the Jewish people. He builds 2 other temples in the north. One in Beit El and one in way up north in Dan. Up near Tel Dan today. And he puts golden calves in them. Now, he doesn't say these are gods, but he puts alternative images as a way of like intermediaries to God. And once you start doing that, once you open the door to idolatry by introducing alternative sites and alternative modes of worship and images, it's going to be a huge problem. The whole northern kingdom is going to be led into idolatry because of this. You open up a crack in the dam, it turns into a floodgate. And this is going to begin what is a terrible period of 240 years when you're going to have 19 different kings, the kings of Israel. Virtually all of them are a disaster. The northern part of Israel is a mess. When I mean disaster, it means they're corrupt, they're evil, they're into idolatry, and they lead the Jewish people into idolatry. And if you read the second book of Kings, you'll read all the stories about these people. Some of them are great leaders in terms of powerful people who have large empires and great armies and unify the northern kingdom. But spiritually, they're a mess. And one thing we know is if we don't have our act together spiritually, we're not going to have our act together physically, ultimately. So you're going to have 19 kings for 240 years, which means that on average, 12 and a half years is going to be a new king. The succession of the kings of the north is very bloody. It's like the worst successions you see in the Roman Empire. Like in the 3rd century, you had this, every couple of years you had a new emperor. Now Shemaiah the prophet goes and tells Yerovam ben Nevat, king of the north, you blew it. You blew it. You introduced alternative cult sites. You lead the Jewish people to idolatry. Your whole family is going to die out. Okay, now he rules for 22 years, and after his son Nadav, who becomes king, is murdered. And that begins a long list of succession of really, really, really bad kings. Now we have one king by the name, I'm not going to go through all the details, but there's a king by the name of Omri, who comes later. Omri is going to build a capital city in the north, in the place called Shamron, which we call Samaria today, the city. You can still go up there north. Herod builds a city there later, Sebastia. But Shamron, we get the name today, Judea and Samaria. It's going to refer to the split of Israel into 2 separate kingdoms. Shamron, Samaria in the north, that's the kingdom of Israel. And Yehuda in the south. It's called Yehuda because it's 2 tribes. Benjamin and Yehuda make up the southern kingdom, with Rehoboam as their king and Rehoboam's descendants. These are all kings from the house of King David are going to rule in the southern kingdom. But Judea and Samaria, and you hear that terminology, you should know that it comes from the split of Israel, going back to the date is about 796, Jewish calendar date. The northern kingdom is going to go from 796 to 556. Again, that's going to be our 240-year period, 19 kings over that period of time. They're all bad news. Now, again, not to go through all the details because we don't have time. I want to just talk about one story which is very interesting. This is the story of Achav and Eliyahu Hanavi. Now, Achav is he's definitely up there in the list of the worst kings in the history of the Jewish people. Achav is one of the kingdoms in the north. He marries a woman by the name of Isabel. Jezebel the witch. That's where the name comes from. It's the Anglo-Saxon derivative. She introduces Baal worship into the Jewish people, which is it's the Canaanite worship of Baal Peor, was the big god that was in this part of the world. You know how Baal Peor was worshipped? I don't know if I told you this before. The way you worship Baal Peor was you ate lots of red beets and you defecated in front of the idol. Pretty interesting idea, right? And this wasn't just to be gross. I mean, the reality was there's a very profound idea behind that, which is a perversion of a Jewish idea. In Judaism, you go to the bathroom, you make a blessing, because everything you do is part of, there's a spiritual component to everything you do. Everything has to do has a relationship with God on some level. So a lot of idolatry is the idea of this pantheistic idea of everything is natural. It's an expression of spirituality. So you defecate in front of Baal, and by the way, the redder it was, the better it was. That's why you ate red beets. Okay, and if you did it right, you got a high out of that was much greater than almost anything you could do today. Much better than any designer drugs. I know to us it sounds like the weirdest idea, defecating in front of an idol. But you did it back then, it was, as they say in Yiddish, geschmacht. You really got something out of it. Because, remember, we have to keep in mind, when we talk about idolatry is a concept that is very hard for us to understand, because spirituality is a concept hard for us to understand. Because it's really more or less absent in the world, both pure spirituality and impure spirituality. Going back 2,500, 3,000 years ago, we say, right, to give you the choice to make real decisions, you have to have real spirituality, and you have to have real impure spirituality. If impure spirituality was a joke, no one would be tempted to worship idols, and there'd be no real decision involved. So you could worship these idols and get a big high out of it. Now, it's also important to understand when you're reading the books of Kings and looking what the Jewish people were doing. Today, we have people who aren't. The Jewish world is not into anything. We're into money and success. Those are the false gods of the Jews today. And liberalism is the number one false god of the Jewish world today. In the ancient world, the false gods that people worshipped, today we have secular society. In the ancient world, people were very religious. And these people at the time weren't giving up Torah and worshiping idols. They were doing both. Meaning they were keeping glatt kosher and defecating in front of Baal Peor. That was like on Sunday or something. It's like a new mitzvah to the Jewish people. It's hard for us to understand. These people were on a very high level spiritually. And everything they did with gusto. So it wasn't like they all gave up Shabbat and Kashrut and they were just worshiping idols. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. So there's a great story that takes place during the reign of King Achav and his witch wife Jezebel. Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu, who, again, all of these prophets, most of them were being hounded. Several of them were going to be killed by kings. Both the northern and southern kingdoms the kings are going to kill different prophets. Isaiah we're going to see is killed. There's a lot of prophets were murdered because, as we say, a prophet is never appreciated or listened to in his lifetime. The role of the prophets by this period of time is solely to try and get the Jewish people in both the northern and southern kingdoms to do tshuva, to avoid the disaster which is going to come upon them for dropping our side of the bargain. So what does Elijah do? He goes up north. He goes to Mount Carmel. Now, if you go today to Mount Carmel is a big mountain range. On one end is Haifa. On the other end is a place called the Muhraka, which is actually a monastery. I think a Carmelite monastery up there. And there's a statue outside the monastery of Elijah with a sword. This is almost certainly the place where the story takes place because the geographic description matches perfectly. It's an amazing view, by the way. He wants the Jewish people to see that idolatry is nonsense and that there's one God. So he challenges 450 priests of Baal to a duel. And this is not like pistols, at dawn. He says, look, you guys bring a couple of your calves, you make an altar, and all the Jewish people are invited to watch. It's like a big event. He says, you make your altars, you pray to your God. Okay, by the way, there's a drought going on at the same time. It's a punishment. There's no rain coming. Okay? So very interesting story. Make an unbelievable film with special effects. They could do an amazing job. We'll get Spielberg onto this one. And the priests of Baal make their altar and they put their animals on it and they pray and they're praying all day. They're schwitzing and they're davening and nothing's happening and they start slashing their heads with knives to bleed. They believe the gods need blood and nothing happens. Eventually they give up. It's really embarrassing. All the Jewish people are watching. And then Elijah says, now make me an altar. Okay, put 12 stones around it, symbolic of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people in unity, and put my animal offering on top. And he prays. But first of all, he says, submerge the whole thing in water. Just bury the whole thing in gallons and gallons of water so it can't even burn. And he prays. And it's really cool. It's like, this cloud appears, and a fire comes down from heaven, and it consumes the animal, and the water, and the stones. And all the Jewish people, they're like, whoa, awesome. They all fall down. They're all screaming, God is king, God is king. And the next day, they're back defecating in front of Baal Peor. And Elijah tells them, he says, how long will you sit on the fence? Either choose idolatry or choose God. But you have to make a decision. Okay, you can't have one or the other. You have to have one or the other, not both. They put the 450 priests of Baal to death, of course. Right after that, the Jewish people were they want to get, and then, of course, they go back to doing all the stupid things. Elijah has to flee for his life. Jezebel wants to kill him. Doesn't work. Okay. So again, this is one of the many stories. And read the book of Kings, you'll see. Now what's interesting, by the way, is of all the prophets that exist during this period of time, we only know 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. Only those prophets whose message is relevant to the Jewish people throughout history are going to be recorded here. So you should know there's a lot more people running around. But the big main ones that we know about are going to be the ones that we remember. The northern kingdom is going to just sink down spiritually, down. Eventually, we're going to take a break now and go to the southern kingdom and see what's happening there. But eventually, it's going to lead to God basically deciding, since you don't keep your end of the bargain, you will not be allowed to stay in the land. And he will find certain nations who will take it upon themselves to do the will of God and throw the Jewish people out of the land of Israel. That's going to all take place during the second book of Kings. Yes, Max?
You said there were... 1.5 million prophets running around?
The Talmud makes statements like 1 million. It's not like 1 million prophets between the time of Moses to Malachi, to the end of the period of the prophets.
And who was the one, or who are the people who decided that there should be only 55?
Who decided there should be the 48 and the 7? We'll hold that question. When we get to the men of the Great Assembly, I'm going to answer that exactly. But I'm just letting you know now that there are a lot more prophets running around, just the big ones we hear about. And again, almost all of them have a very difficult time. Jewish people don't listen to most of them. Yeah.
I was told that Elijah's wife wrote him a letter and said, "Yeah, I saw her. That was a really good miracle, but I'm going to kill you."
No, Jezebel's wife. Yeah, yeah.
And so basically, the reason that he ran into the forest was basically he was saying like, "Listen, there's nothing I'm going to do to prove to you that a miracle can really exist," and I'm not going to. He was just sort of despondent with the Jewish people.
There's a great story about him going to the desert, and he goes according to tradition down to Mount Sinai, and and God comes by, and there's this wind and all these different things happening, and then he hears the still small voice, which is God. It's a very powerful story with a lot of very powerful imagery in it. Yes, he's very despondent. A lot of these prophets had a very tough time, but they try hard. This is a very unusual case of you're not supposed to ask for miracles. It's a very dangerous thing to do. The Bible's full of people asking for things and having them backfire on them. This just shows how desperate a guy like Elijah is to try and get the Jewish people back, and it doesn't work because people, to quote the great Rabbi Simon and Garfunkel, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. It's one of the great insanities of human nature, and you see it throughout Jewish history. People can have tremendous clarity 1 minute, there's a God, God is king, and then the next day they're worshiping Baal Peor again. And he realizes we don't believe, and it's a very important lesson also, we don't believe in God because of miracles. It's very important we get to Christianity. We'll talk about this idea. Someone doing a miracle does not make you God. We're going to talk a lot about false prophets. Doing a miracle doesn't make you a prophet. Certainly not God, but it doesn't make you a prophet. Miracles are not something that today we'd be very impressed with them. Again, the ancient world, as I mentioned previously, not so amazing. Okay, let's go to the southern kingdom. Now, the southern kingdom, which goes from 877 BCE till 422, 454 years. So we're going to see it lasts for almost 200 years longer than the northern kingdom. Why does it last longer? Because it is nowhere near as unstable as the northern kingdom, and some of the kings, unlike this of the northern kingdom, some of the kings of the southern kingdom are actually very, very righteous. But the same problem that plagues the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom plagues the southern kingdom. We're going to have a series of several extremely bad kings who are going to bring idolatry into the kingdom of the south, into Yehuda. And as the Jewish people are going to decline spiritually, so too are we going to lose our right to live in the southern part of the land of Israel. Granted, we'll be there for a couple hundred years longer, but we're going to suffer the same fate in the south as in the north. The difference being in the south, the northern exile we're going to see is going to be a permanent exile. The southern one is not going to be, and the southern one is going to culminate in the destruction of what is the first temple. Okay. Now, we're going to have 22 kings during this period of time, which means that the kings of the southern kingdom reign for much longer. Northern kingdom, it's an average of 12 and a half years. Southern kingdom, it's 20 years, which means they're better kings. They're more stable. The succession is better. It's more stable. You'll see in history, when you have rapid number of kings, any empire like Rome is a great example, it's always a clear indication of instability within a country or within an empire. Now, some of these kings are very, very righteous. The one king I want to focus on especially is a man by the name of Hezekiah, Hezekiah HaMelech, who's the 15th king after King David, who rules from, it's 590 to 561 BCE. Okay, he's towards the end, 590 to 561 BCE, who's a very, very righteous, he's going to rule for 29 years, a very, very righteous king. Okay, and it says about him, I want to read you how good he is, because often you'll find in the book of Kings horrible things being said about these different people. It says, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like all that his father David had done. And he trusted in the God of Israel. There was none like him among all the kings of Yehuda who were after him, nor were there before him. That's from 2 Kings 18, 3-5. And that's a pretty high praise. He's saying he's as great as David. Meaning if he had been the king, which is why I said if he had been the next king, a guy like Hezekiah instead of a guy like Rehoboam, after Solomon, who knows, all of Jewish history would have been different. And we described that the level of not just the level of Torah knowledge amongst the Jewish people in the south was incredibly high. Everyone was a Talmud Chacham during his reign. There was no idolatry in the southern kingdom. Okay, tremendous period of time. Now, to step back for a second, look what's going on in the world. Now, we talked about during David and Solomon's reigns, the two great empires that we are trapped in between are Egypt in the west and Assyria in the east. They basically are on the wane during the reigns of David and Solomon, which gives, as I mentioned in the last class, Israel an opportunity, a window of opportunity to expand because there are no great external empires. We're going to see that during this period of time, both Egypt and especially Assyria are going to emerge as major world powers again. Assyria is going to create at this period of time one of the earliest great world empires. It's going to expand very rapidly. It's going to absorb all of the northern and southern kingdoms into its hegemony. Eventually, it's going to even absorb Egypt, one of the few times Egypt is going to be conquered. We're going to see the Assyrians are going to go on to try and invade, when we get later in history, to the Persian Empire. They're going to invade even Greece itself. So we're talking about the emergence of great world empires. Well, now that Israel is a weak and divided country, will not be able to fight off those threats. And as I said, both the northern and southern kingdoms are going to become vassal states. So much of the history of this period of time is going to be poor little northern and southern kingdoms trapped between Egypt and Assyria, and often trying to play one off against the other. Assyria, generally being the dominant power, is going to, for most of the time, be dominating both the northern and southern kingdoms. So during this period of time, during the reign of King Hezekiah, Israel is already a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire. And it's during this period of time that Hezekiah, who is the king, is going to make an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt against Assyria. Okay, and the idea is that we will throw the Assyrians out, and we will gain our own autonomy, and Egypt will gain by pushing the Assyrian threat further away from its border. Now, the reason I'm talking about this story is a very interesting story because we have clear archaeological evidence of it. We talk about the patriarchal period of the Bible. We don't have direct archaeological evidence for it. We have a lot of superficial, circumstantial evidence for that period of time. Once you get to the Book of Kings, we have all kinds of external records and archaeological evidence within the land of Israel that directly deals with the stories in the Bible. And there's a great story when Hezekiah revolts against the Assyrian Emperor Sennacherib with the backing of the Egyptians. He fortifies Jerusalem. He fortifies Jerusalem in expectation of the Assyrian, invasion of Israel to try and crush this Jewish revolt. So Hezekiah does a number of things that are very, very significant, which you can see today. One thing is he includes much of the part of Jerusalem, which is outside the walls, which is today the Jewish quarter, by the way, within the walls of the city. If you go to the post office in the Jewish quarter, you can see a remnant of a wall, which we call the Broad Wall, which almost all archaeologists agree is the quickly erected wall built by Hezekiah to fight off the Assyrian invasion. It's really cool. You can see a wall dealing with exactly that period of time. If you look at the post office, go look there today, walk by there, you can see you'd be standing outside the wall looking inside the walls of the city. That's where the Jewish defenders were. The other thing he does is he enlarges the water supply system to the city. Until that time, a small tunnel had connected the original city which the Jebusites inhabited, and which David inhabited, and which future kings of Israel had built on, to the Gihon spring outside the walls. What Hezekiah does is he gets two teams of diggers digging. He builds an artificial reservoir inside the walls of the city, and then probably following the natural dolomite limestone fissure in the wall, he makes this really cool 570 meter long tunnel, which is not even straight because it's almost certainly following a fissure in the rock, and he brings the water supply inside the walls of the city. You can walk through that tunnel today. It's called Hezekiah's Tunnel. It's in the Arab village of Silwan. It's a really great place to walk through. It's very interesting. There's a plaque actually put in place by the diggers when they met, sort of like when they finished the Channel Tunnel from connecting England and France. Like they waved little flags through each end and they had a little party. So that plaque was unfortunately removed by the Turks, and it's in the museum in Istanbul. But it's a very significant piece of archaeology.
They removed it and put it in
the British pillaged the entire Middle East and put it all in the British Museum. You can see, and you go to the British Museum, you can see the Meshish stone, which has the tribute paid by King Yehu of the northern kingdom of Israel to the king of Assyria. You can see the kings of Assyria mentioning in various finds. The British Museum is the best collection of all this stuff in the world. You can see all kinds of examples of external sources talking about. You can see Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. Okay, with the walls of the palace showing the siege of Lachish. Lachish was one of the fortified chariot cities built by King Solomon, a very famous piece of archaeology which the British stripped off the city of Nineveh today in Iraq and brought to the British Museum. Very interesting piece of archaeology. So there's all kinds of stuff. We're dealing with a very historical period where we have direct evidence for this. So Hezekiah rebels, fortifies the city, brings the water supply within the walls. Sennacherib comes to the walls of the city, and he besieges the city. Now, by the way, if you go to the British Museum also, you can see there's a stone inscription from Sennacherib which says, Hezekiah, king of Yehuda, I locked in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Now, noticeably absent from that is the description of Jerusalem falling, because it doesn't fall. The Bible's description is that the Assyrians besiege the city, and a plague hits the city. The plague hits the Assyrian camp, and all of the Assyrian army is wiped out. Supernatural. Jewish people are saved. Sennacherib flees back to Assyria, where, of course, he's murdered not soon after by his children. Okay, and not too long after, which is the typical thing to happen to many monarchs in history, his kids bump him off, and the siege is lifted, and the southern kingdom is going to survive. Okay, miraculous. Okay, we survive. Only on the merit of Hezekiah being a righteous guy and the Jewish people still being on a reasonably high level, we're saved. Now, Hezekiah is a very interesting story I also want to tell you because it answers your question about God knowing what's going to be in the future. The prophet Isaiah goes to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah is sick. He's very sick, and Isaiah says, "You're going to die." And Hezekiah asks Isaiah, "Why?" And Isaiah tells Hezekiah, "It's because you disobeyed God, and you didn't fulfill the commandment of marrying, having children, being fruitful and multiplying." And Hezekiah says, "You know why I didn't do it? Because I knew through prophecy. I knew. I'm destined to have really evil offspring coming out of me. Okay, and I don't want that to happen. I'd rather die childless." And Isaiah says, "It's not for you." This is the point. He says, "It's not for you through any means to decide what's going to be in the future. You have to do what you're commanded to do. If there's a commandment to have children, you have children." And he says, "It's too late. You're going to die." And he walks away. And then God tells Isaiah, "Go back and tell Hezekiah I grant him a reprieve." But it's interesting. Hezekiah says to Isaiah, "I'll tell you what. You give me. I'll tell you what. He says, I'll marry your daughter. Okay? I'm a righteous guy," Hezekiah says. "You're a righteous guy. Your daughter's a big tzedekis. There's a chance we'll have righteous children." And Isaiah says, "Too bad. No, it's too late. You didn't listen to God." And he walks away, and God says, "Go back, give him a second chance." And that's what happens, by the way. He goes back and says, "You're going to be cured, and you have a second chance." And he marries Isaiah's daughter. And who comes from it? Exactly as he knew was going to happen. He has a son by the name of Manasseh, who was like as bad as it gets. It says in 2 Kings chapter 21 verses 2 through 3. And he did that which was talking about Manasseh. And he did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, like the abomination of the nations that the Lord had driven out from before the children of Israel. And he made the Asherah as Achab, the king of Israel, had made, and he worshipped them. Manasseh is so bad, he even has Isaiah put to death, the prophet. It's bad news. And he kills. It's bad news. So the whole kingdom is going to go into decline. The same thing. We have a couple of righteous kings, Josiah, but it's not enough to stop the spiritual decline and therefore the physical end of the southern kingdom also. So you have a repeat. It's just that it's happening. The crash is taking place quicker in the northern kingdom than the southern kingdom. What's the end of the northern kingdom? Now we talked about the rise of Assyria. In the 6th century, Jewish chronology now. Of course, that's not going to match exactly the chronologies by Western historians, but Tiglath-Pileser is going to unite Assyria and make a great empire, which is going to expand into the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians introduce a very interesting way of pacifying peoples they conquer. What do? They take people out. This is going to be a policy that's going to be carried on by the Babylonians and the Persians, and later by the Turks and even the Russians. It's a policy that's unique to this part of the world. To pacify people we conquer, we remove the population, move them somewhere else, and bring someone else in their place. By the time they figure out where they are, it'll take them a few decades. They won't remember to rebel anymore. They'll be so disoriented and so out of place. Okay? So what he does, starting around 575, is he's going to remove, as a way of pacifying the northern kingdoms, he takes Zvulun and Naphtali, 2 of the 10 tribes of the north, and he exiles them. Okay. Then in 567, Shalmaneser V, another Assyrian emperor. This is all taking place during a period of time of around 22 years, from beginning to end. Because the upstart kings in the north are not going to. The Assyrians are going to feel they're not loyal and not stable. So what do? They're going to pick away at pieces of the kingdom. This is God's way of telling the Jewish people, because you don't do what you're supposed to, you're going to go into exile. So Shalmaneser V takes Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, the tribes, and exiles them. Finally, in 556, Sargon, one of the great emperors of Assyria, the king, Hoshea ben Elah, who ruled for 19 years, he is going to make a treaty with Egypt again. We're going to see this over and over again, against the Assyrians, to try and throw the Assyrians out. This fails. The Assyrians come in, and they exile the remaining tribes in the north. The whole northern part of the country is going to cease to exist as a Jewish state. I want to read you the quote. This is from 2 Kings 17, 6 through 18. And the king of Assyria took Samaria and exiled the Israelites to Assyria. And he settled them in Hala and Habor, the Gozan River, and the cities of Media. And the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all the prophets of all the visions, saying, Repent of your evil ways and keep my commandments. But they did not heed, and they hearkened, and they hardened their neck. And the Lord became very angry with Israel, and he sent them away from before him. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. The whole northern kingdom is gone. Now, who do the Assyrians put in place? They bring a bunch of people who are later going to be called as the Samaritans, the Shamronim, as we say in Hebrew. We all know them from the story in the New Testament called the Good Samaritan. By the way, big rule. Anyone in the New Testament says is good, you can be sure from the Jewish perspective is bad. And anyone in the New Testament says is bad, you can be sure from the Jewish perspective is good. The Shamronim are people who more or less adopt Judaism. Not completely. They're never accepted by the Jewish people and the rabbis. And because of that, they're very resentful and always are trying to get the Jewish people back. They're going to make lots of tsuris, as we say in Yiddish. Lots of problems for the Jewish people in history. Today, there are about 600 Shamronim left. Their capital cult site is in Mount Gerizim, which is right next to the city of Shechem or Nablus. But the whole northern part of the country, they go into exile. What happens to those 10 tribes? The 10 lost tribes, they assimilate. Now, there's a midrash that says they're over the river Sambaton, which is this mystical river that flows one way, and on Sabbath it flows the other way, and they can't cross it. Again, midrash, you have to be very careful. There's not a river that flows one way and another way. The point is, they go into exile, and they're pretty much disappeared. Now, what's interesting is there are people all throughout even to the Far East, who claim to be descended from the 10 lost tribes today. Where are they? We don't know. There's a professor of history, Tudor Parfitt, at University College in London, who's obsessed with this 10 lost tribe stuff. He's written a book called The 13th Gate. He's done all kinds of interesting programs on these people who claim to have Jewish connections. It's amazing how many people, many of whom hate the Jews but claim to be descended from us. There are 15 million people called Pathans, mostly in northern Afghanistan, who claim to be descended from the 10 lost tribes. They're Muslim fundamentalists with a lot of Jewish traditions. They have all kinds of Jewish traditions. Very interesting. Can you imagine if they all decide to make Aliyah? We'll have like 15 million Mujahideen fighters. Go ahead, Assad, make my day. But what happens to them is a normal process of what happened to most people. Virtually everyone, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, are going to exile. They're going to assimilate out of existence. Now, we have a concept. In the end of days, all the lost Jews will come back. Much of the idea about converts are they are lost souls who are Jews who are trying to find their way back to the Jewish people. But they're gone. Okay? That's what's happening. Now, just to jump back, I want to end. Let's go a couple minutes more. I want to end with the destruction of Jerusalem, because it's a very important spot to end on, which is the end of the book of Kings. The southern kingdom, as I mentioned, is also going into tremendous decline. By the way, we say that prior to the destruction, the king, Josiah, he, realizing that the temple is destined to be destroyed, he hides the Ark of the Covenant because he knows he doesn't want it to fall into the hands of the non-Jews. We talk about the Second Temple. We'll discuss a little about where it is. But already people are aware, as the prophets keep saying, repent you sinners, the end is near, and the Jewish people aren't listening. Now, again, what's going on? Already the northern kingdom is gone. The Samaritans are there. Israel's a vassal state. The second to last king is a king by the name of Jehoiachin in 434 BCE. The Assyrian empire is overrun by the new world power called Babylon. Babylon marches on Israel, basically to stake its claim to the former Syrian empire. The Babylonians invade. Now, we're talking about 11 years prior to the destruction of the first temple in 422. The Babylonians take Jehoiachin and 10,000 best and brightest Jews. And they take them all out of the kingdom, and they march them down to Babylon as captives. At the time, this seemed like a tremendous disaster. Can you imagine, like, the Soviet Union invades, America during the Cold War, conquers the country and takes the million best and brightest people out? We'd all be like, oh my God, this is a disaster, a huge enforced brain drain. Now we're going to see that this is going to be a huge blessing in disguise. The Babylonians take Jehoiachin out, and they put his uncle, who's a man by the name of Tzedkiah, Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, Tzedkiah. They make him a puppet king. They tell him, you behave yourself. Okay? Now, it's a big mistake, because Zedekiah is not a good king at all. He's a weak ruler with a big ego, and he decides that he's going to rebel. In the 9th year of his reign, it's amazing how many times the Jews do this. He makes an alliance with the Egyptians against the Assyrians, which is done so many times you lose track. It never worked. The Egyptians never were able. They didn't show up, or the Assyrians stopped them from intervening on our behalf. He rebels against the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar sends his chief general Nebuzaradan to besiege this city. The Egyptians are not able to come and help. Okay, he besieges the city for 2 years. Now, this is a very interesting story also, because we have clear archaeological evidence for this too. In the old city, if you go to Shoneh Halachot Street, a little bit north of that broad wall I was telling you about, you'll see there is a modern apartment building built over what's called the Israelite Tower. If you go down about 60 feet underground, you'll see that there is the remains of an E-gate, a 3-doored gate, which is the northern defensive wall of the city, because the north was always the weak spot of Jerusalem, having no natural valleys to defend it. They found outside that E-gate, archaeologists in the early 1970s found clear evidence of the Babylonian siege. They found arrowheads, Israelite and Babylonian arrowheads. The arrowheads have names on them, by the way. Arrowheads were very valuable. It also, I guess, let you know who you killed. You pull it out of the guy, my kill, They found clear evidence of the siege, a layer of charred earth. The Babylonians besieged the city for 2 years. Now, remember, real politics, what's going on? Little teeny Israel rebels against major world power and suffers the consequences. Real reason, Israel blows in a relationship with God, and now we're suffering the consequences for it. We thought we were invincible. We thought that just like in Hezekiah's time, when God had saved the Jewish people from the Assyrians through a plague, we're going to be saved now. No such luck. After 2 years of siege, the Babylonians breach the walls of the city. They pour into the city. They carry out a huge slaughter. Again, we find evidence of the burning and destruction in the archaeological excavations here. Now, Zedekiah tries to flee through the secret tunnel that connects Jerusalem to the Dead Sea area. We say it's still there today, the secret tunnel. And it's very interesting. A deer runs above the tunnel. Nebuzaradan is out hunting, while his men are pillaging the city. He's out hunting, and he's following the deer. This is, again, God's way of assuring that Zedekiah is not going to escape punishment. And when Hezekiah comes out of the tunnel, there's the deer standing there, and there's the Babylonians chasing the deer, and they catch Hezekiah. And what does it say? If you look in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 7 through 11, and they slaughtered Zedekiah's sons before his eyes, and they blinded Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with copper chains and brought him to Babylon. Nebuzaradan, chief executioner, servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burnt the house of the Lord in the king's palace and all the houses of Jerusalem. And Nebuzaradan, the chief executioner, exiled the remnant of the people who remained in the city and the rest of the populace. What day does it take place on? The 9th of the year 422, Jewish calendar date. I remember if you look in secular history books, it'll say 586, 164-year difference. That's a chronology discrepancy we have with, not to get into that again, but you look on your little timelines here. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroys first temple, 422 BCE. Here's the first of a number of excellent reasons God is giving us to cry. Okay? And we have to appreciate, just think about it. The temple stood for 410 years. We had been in the land of Israel. We're talking about for over 850 years, and it all comes crashing down. You're talking about a tremendous physical destruction, a tremendous spiritual and ego deflation of the Jewish people. God has forsaken us. And we can't begin to imagine what it must have felt like. There's a psalm that is not one of the psalms King David wrote, obviously, because it takes place later. It's by the rivers of Babylon. Peter Tosh sings a song, by the rivers of... Don McLean sings a version of it. This is a song of the Jewish people being forced marched into, not slavery, they weren't enslaved, but this was the way of the Babylonians have, this is the way we're going to carry on the Assyrian policy. We're going to pacify the Jewish people by moving more or less the entire population out of the country, schlepped them down there. And the Jewish people were tremendously depressed. How can we sing? How can we be normal? How can we carry on as Jews in such a terrible situation when everything we knew to be normal and our relationship with God, everything seems to be destroyed? So we end now at the end of the book of Kings with, we started out at the beginning. It's such a big drop from the high point of Jewish history to the lowest of the lows. Okay, so we'll stop here now with the Jewish people being marched into exile. We're going to pick it up next class. Tomorrow I'm not going to be here. We're going to pick it up on Tuesday with one of the most interesting stories in Jewish history, which is the Jews in Babylon and the Purim story.
This program is part of a series. For the continuation, please insert the next disc.